So love it or hate it, portrait mode or vertical video is something we're all going to have to embrace. Personally, I've done lots of vertical videos for clients. I'm starting to realize, as someone who uses a gimbal quite a lot, that a lot of these gimbals aren't really optimized for vertical video. Even though some of them might have vertical modes, actually workarounds tend to be better. So in front of me, I've got 4 different gimbals from 3 different brands. Over here, I've got the Zhiyun Weeble S, I've got the Moza AirCross 3, and over here, I've got the DJI RSC2 and the DJI RS3 Pro. And in this video, I'm going to be comparing the vertical shooting possibilities on each of these gimbals. Meanwhile, let me know down below how you're dealing with vertical shooting. How are you doing it? Are you rigging up your camera, or are you just ignoring it completely? Either way, let me know in the comment section down below. Okay, so let's start with the Zhiyun Weeble S, and this happens to be my favorite gimbal of all time. I just love the design, I love how compact and lightweight it is, and I love how when you're using it, all the movements just feel really, really natural. Unfortunately, I know this is a common problem, but the locks have kind of broken on mine, so the axis doesn't lock anymore. But this gimbal has been with me everywhere and genuinely one of my favorite gimbals of all time. The problem with the Weeble S though is because it came out a while ago, there's not actually a dedicated portrait mode in the software, which is not actually a terribly bad thing given that the portrait mode in the software of the other gimbals isn't great anyway, and we'll get into that in a minute. But you can kind of get around that by putting either an L plate or a cage onto your camera and just putting like the base plate on the bottom. Now personally, I use the Manfrotto RC2 plates, I think they are, which actually makes it a lot harder to mount these cameras vertically on these gimbals, and it's hard enough as it is, as we're about to get into. But basically I've got a cage on this A7S III here, and I've got the Weeble S plate connected to it. So all we've got to do then is just unlock all the axes, put it on, and then we're in vertical mode. But then the thing is, of course, you've got to balance it, and the tilt motor doesn't actually balance properly because the center of gravity, I guess, is too high. So you can't actually get the tilt motor far down enough to balance the gimbal properly. I'm sure you could put a lighter lens on here and kind of balance it as well as possible, turn it on, and it might compensate for some of that weight. But personally, I'm looking for a perfectly balanced gimbal, and the Weeble S just can't do it with a top-heavy setup like a vertically mounted camera. Just because it's so small and the arms are so small, it's really not designed for those top-heavy setups. So the Weeble S is not for vertical shooting. Don't buy this gimbal for vertical shooting. So moving on to the next gimbal, and the next gimbal we're going to look at is the DJI RSC2. This might be just the best value gimbal around right now. It's got a great payload, it's still quite small, it's really well built, it folds up small so you can put it in your bag, and it's just generally all around a really good gimbal to use. So the DJI RSC2 actually does have a portrait mode, so let's put that into portrait mode now. But the thing is, all it does is point the camera upwards like this. So when you're shooting portrait content, you're sort of forced to film it like this. It's putting a lot of pressure on your wrist at the top, and that's even if you've got an underslung grip. If you don't, you're sort of forced to shoot like this, which is it's just not sustainable for a full day of shooting. And I don't really think it's a great way of implementing the whole portrait mode on a gimbal sort of thing. It is there if you need it, but like I say, I don't think you'd want to shoot in a full day like this. So again, just like the Weeble S, you can actually put an L bracket or a cage onto your camera, mount the mounting plate on the side, and then put that onto the RSC2. But even on the RSC2, the setup still won't balance because the tilt axis won't go down far enough, just because we're still pretty top heavy over here. But the benefit of doing this on the RSC2 instead of the Weeble S is the fact that RSC2 does have really, really strong motors. So if you do balance it as well as it will possibly go, you can see it's definitely not balanced right now on the tilt axis. But you can kind of turn it on and the motors will sort of compensate and do the rest of the work. I recommend obviously calibrating as much as you can on each shoot, or when you change lens if you're doing this, because again, you're not balanced properly and the motors are doing most of the work. But at the same time, this can actually work, and it's a really comfortable portrait mode setup on the DJI RSC2. Better than the portrait mode that's built into the software. So yeah, you can actually use the RSC2 for portrait mode, whether you choose to use the strange portrait mode where you have to sort of hold it like that, or you actually mount it with an L bracket or a cage on its side and try and balance it. But either way isn't really perfect. And I think the RS3 is supposed to have a similar payload and weight and sort of size and everything. So I don't think the RS3 is gonna be much better than it. On a side note, I really need to get some lights for this bookcase that don't run out of battery, because every single light I have runs out of battery halfway through shooting. So moving on to two of the best gimbals for portrait mode in my opinion, and starting with the DJI RS3 Pro. Now this one's one of the best in my opinion just because it takes the brute force method. And what I mean by this is because the gimbal is so big and the arms are so long, you can actually mount the camera like this, so it's top heavy on the side like this, and still manage to balance it. So we've been through the Weebill S and the DJI RSC2, and you can actually balance a camera on it if you mounted it like this on vertical mode. But with this gimbal, you can actually balance it perfectly, even if you've mounted the camera vertically. That wasn't balanced perfectly. But of course, when you turn the gimbal on, it doesn't actually need to work as hard because the camera is actually balanced on there properly. So I think this is a really efficient vertical setup for if you're shooting all day in vertical mode, for example. And this is the kind of brute force way of doing it, where you've got some really strong motors, a big gimbal with long arms, and a sort of L bracket on here. What I'm about to show you next is the Moza AirCross 3, and I think that is the clever way of doing it. And now finally on to what I think is the best gimbal for portrait mode in my opinion. And when I say for portrait mode, I don't mean it's the best all-around gimbal, but if you're looking for a gimbal just for portrait mode, this might actually just be it. So the Moza AirCross 3 I reviewed in a previous video, which I'll link down below in the description and put up here somewhere. But it's generally a really good gimbal. They have a unique way of approaching like the underslung mode where you undo it, press a button and fold it in half like this. But what this ended up doing is covering up the controls, so you can't move the joystick or change any of the settings while you're in that mode. So if you're happy to get around that, it's a really good gimbal. But yeah, check out my full review for more information on that. Now, I don't think in the Moza AirCross 3 there's any software way to get into vertical mode, but the way they've made the gimbal to get into vertical mode is genius. So obviously I've got the camera mounted just without a cage at the moment, with a quick release plate on the bottom and the Manfrotto plate on the gimbal itself. And obviously this is your normal sort of landscape shooting mode, which is fine, it's all good. It works fine on this gimbal. But what you can actually then do is press an unlock button, take this whole plate off of the gimbal, and then slide it on to the side bit, like that. And then before you know it, you've got portrait mode. And I think that's just a really quick and genius way of making a gimbal great for landscape mode and portrait mode without having to put any additional software bits in there. And the best thing is balancing this A7S III and Sigma 24-70, which is one of the heavier lenses for Sony E-mount, perfectly. So when you turn it on, it's all good to go. The motors aren't working too hard. It's just a really natural experience with vertical shooting. And of course, as a bonus, you don't really need a cage or an L bracket on your camera, which is good for me because I'm more of a minimalist. I like to keep things as simple as possible. But yeah, so having that and then just being able to take that back off and put it into landscape mode, I think is probably one of the best integrations of portrait mode on a gimbal that I've seen. Now to finish off then, I'm definitely not saying that you should buy this gimbal or really any of these gimbals. But what I'm saying is you need to really identify what it is you want from your vertical mode. Do you want something that's really easy and the hardware just to swap between? Would you rather go the brute force method, put a cage on your camera, put it on the RS3 Pro and actually have some of those extra features that the RS3 Pro offers, like the automatic locking and things like that? So you've really got to decide what's best for you. But what I'd recommend is if you're shooting vertical video on your gimbal, then either the Moza AirCross 3 or the DJI RS3 Pro are two of the best gimbals for that. That's been it from me. If you've got any comments or questions on what we've spoken about today, leave them down below in the comment section. If you found this video informative or helpful at all, leave a thumbs up for the algorithm. And if you want to see more videos like this, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.